Imagine a brilliant college student who could read people's minds being silently murdered in her locked dormitory room with no witnesses and no clear motive. Before we dive into one of New England's most haunting unsolved mysteries that took 5 decades to crack, hit that subscribe button right now and ring the notification bell. Because what you're about to discover will change everything you think you know about trust and evil hiding in plain sight. This is the story of Sarah Elizabeth Fitzgerald, and I promise you, the truth behind her death will leave you questioning everyone around you. October 17, 1971 was supposed to be just another quiet Sunday morning at Boston College. The autumn leaves painted the campus in brilliant reds and golds, while students slept peacefully in their dormitories after a typical Saturday night of studying and socializing. But in room 314 of Morrison Hall, something terrible had happened under the cover of darkness. Sarah Elizabeth Fitzgerald was everything a prestigious college could want in a student. At 22 years old, she carried herself with quiet confidence that came from growing up in a world of privilege. Her auburn hair caught sunlight through tall windows as she spent countless hours in Thornton Hall, buried deep in psychology textbooks and research papers that fascinated her brilliant mind. The daughter of a prominent Boston attorney and a classical pianist, Sarah had grown up surrounded by wealth and opportunity. But those who knew her best remembered her genuine kindness more than her family's money. She possessed what her professors called an unusual gift for understanding the human mind, an ability to read people that both impressed and slightly unnerved her classmates. Professor Harold Mitchell, who taught her advanced abnormal psychology course, would later tell investigators that Sarah had an almost supernatural insight into criminal behavior and deviant psychology. Her senior thesis on antisocial personality disorders had impressed the faculty so much that Harvard's graduate program had already extended her an acceptance letter for the following fall. But it was Sarah's compassion that truly set her apart from other privileged students. Every Tuesday and Thursday evening, she volunteered at the Boston Community Center, teaching literacy to local factory workers who had never learned to read properly. Mrs. Eleanor Dubois, the center's coordinator, remembered how Sarah never looked at her watch during those sessions, staying late whenever someone struggled with a particularly difficult passage. Her voice remained patient and encouraging even when exhaustion shadowed her bright green eyes. Sarah treated these working-class adults with the same respect she showed her professors and wealthy classmates, never condescending or acting superior despite the vast differences in their backgrounds and education levels. The weekend before her death, Sarah had seemed different to her roommate Jennifer Walsh. They had shared room 314 since their sophomore year, and Jennifer knew Sarah's moods better than anyone. There was an unusual nervous energy about her that final weekend, a restlessness that kept her pacing their small room late into the night when she should have been sleeping. When Jennifer asked what was troubling her, Sarah had simply smiled and said she was working on something important, something that might help a lot of people. She refused to elaborate, but Jennifer noticed that Sarah kept glancing toward the window as if she expected to see someone watching from outside. Sunday morning arrived crisp and clear, the kind of New England day that made students grateful they had chosen a school surrounded by mountains rather than city streets. The campus chapel bells were ringing for 8 o'clock service when Margaret Costa, the dormitory housekeeper, climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor with her usual cart of cleaning supplies. Mrs. Costa had been working at the college for 15 years, long enough to know which students kept tidy rooms and which ones lived in creative chaos. Sarah's room was always immaculate, which is why she immediately noticed the door standing slightly ajar. In all her years of cleaning that dormitory, Sarah had never left her door unlocked, let alone open. The silence that greeted her gentle knock felt different from the usual quiet of a student sleeping late on Sunday morning. It felt empty somehow, wrong in a way that made her skin crawl with unexplained dread. Mrs. Costa's scream echoed through the 3rd-floor corridor at 8:15. A sound so piercing and raw that students 3 floors below stopped their conversations to listen. By the time the first campus security officer arrived, a small crowd had gathered in the hallway, their faces pale and confused as they stared at the partially open door. Sarah Fitzgerald lay on her narrow dormitory bed, still dressed in the yellow cotton nightgown she had worn to sleep. Her auburn hair fanned across the white pillowcase like spilled wine, and her green eyes stared sightlessly at the ceiling. The peaceful expression on her face suggested she had died without pain, but the ligature marks around her neck told a different story. The room itself presented a puzzle that would torment investigators for the next 50 years. Nothing appeared disturbed. Sarah's textbooks lay open on her desk exactly where she had left them. A psychology journal still turned to an article about antisocial personality disorders. Her fountain pen rested beside a half-completed essay, the ink still wet enough to smudge. But one detail would haunt every investigator who worked the case. A single overturned coffee cup sat on the windowsill, having fallen onto the radiator below and left a brown stain. Sarah never drank coffee. Everyone who knew her could attest to that fact. She was particular about avoiding caffeine, preferring herbal teas that she brewed in a small electric kettle her mother had given her. Someone had been in that room drinking coffee while Sarah lay dead just 6 feet away. Sheriff Thomas Keller had investigated exactly 3 homicides in his 30 years of law enforcement, and none of them had prepared him for the complexity of Sarah Fitzgerald's case. The other murders had been straightforward affairs with obvious perpetrators, clear motives, and abundant evidence. Sarah's case was different. It was like trying to solve a puzzle with half the pieces missing and no picture on the box to guide him. Dr. William Fraser, the county medical examiner, arrived from Springfield at 11 in the morning. His preliminary examination revealed ligature marks around Sarah's neck consistent with manual strangulation, but the positioning of her body suggested she had been carefully arranged after death. Her arms were folded across her chest in an almost peaceful pose, her nightgown straightened and smoothed with careful attention to modesty. The lack of defensive wounds puzzled Dr. Fraser most of all. Sarah's fingernails were clean and unbroken, showing no signs that she had fought her attacker. There were no scratches on her arms, no bruising on her hands that might indicate she had tried to pull away from whatever was used to strangle her. It was as if she had simply lain there and allowed herself to be killed. More disturbing still was evidence that someone had been in the room after Sarah's death. The small electric kettle had been used recently enough that it was still warm when investigators arrived. A single teacup sat in the sink, rinsed clean but still damp. Someone had made tea in that room while Sarah's body lay cooling on the bed. Deputy Robert Lemoyne found the most chilling detail while photographing the scene. On Sarah's desk, beneath her psychology textbook, lay her daily planner open to Sunday, October 17th. In her careful handwriting, she had written a single appointment for 7:30 that evening. Tell the truth. Below that, in different ink and what appeared to be a different hand entirely, someone had crossed out the entry and written in block letters, "Truth told." The pressure began almost immediately. By Monday morning, less than 24 hours after Sarah's body was discovered, Sheriff Keller's small office was flooded with phone calls. Arthur Fitzgerald, Sarah's father, had already contacted the Massachusetts State Police, the FB, and every political connection his law firm had cultivated over the decades. College president Dr. Harold Weber made his position clear during a tense meeting Tuesday afternoon. The college's reputation was at stake, he explained in measured tones. Parents were calling concerned about their children's safety. The board of trustees was asking uncomfortable questions about campus security. The local media had begun investigating, and it was only a matter of time before the Boston papers picked up the story. The forensic capabilities available in 1971 were primitive by any standard. Blood typing was the most sophisticated analysis they could perform, and even that required sending samples to the state laboratory where the backlog meant waiting weeks for results. Fingerprint analysis was limited to what could be seen with the naked eye and a magnifying glass. DNA testing wouldn't be available for criminal investigations for another 15 years. Deputy Lemoyne spent countless hours interviewing Sarah's friends, professors, and acquaintances. Every person he spoke with seemed genuinely shocked by Sarah's death, genuinely bewildered by who might want to harm her. The interviews yielded no obvious suspects, no clear motives, and no witnesses who had seen or heard anything unusual that Sunday morning. The investigation's first major setback came when the Massachusetts State Police Crime Scene Unit finally arrived to process Sarah's dormitory room. By then, the scene had been contaminated by well-meaning campus security officers, curious students, and college maintenance workers. Critical evidence may have been destroyed or overlooked in those crucial first hours. Dr. Fraser's full autopsy report, completed 2 weeks after Sarah's death, raised more questions than it answered. The cause of death was manual strangulation, but the killer had possessed unusual strength and knowledge of anatomy. The pressure had been applied to specific points on Sarah's throat with surgical precision, suggesting either medical training or extensive anatomical knowledge. Toxicology tests revealed trace amounts of a mild sedative in Sarah's blood, not enough to cause unconsciousness, but sufficient to make her drowsy and less likely to fight back. The sedative was commonly used in medical settings, but also available through illegal prescription sales that were becoming increasingly common on college campuses. As autumn turned to winter, the leads dried up one by one. The mysterious coffee cup yielded no usable fingerprints. The appointment notation in Sarah's planner remained unexplained despite extensive investigation. Fabric fibers collected from her fingernails were too degraded to provide meaningful analysis with available technology. By Christmas of that year, the investigation had effectively stalled. Sheriff Keller found himself returning to the evidence room again and again, staring at boxes of collected materials as if they might suddenly reveal their secrets. The case file grew thicker with dead-end leads and inconclusive reports, but the central mystery remained as impenetrable as ever. Detective Maria Santos had never intended to become obsessed with cold cases, but by 2019, the ghosts of unsolved crimes had become her constant companions. She carried their stories in manila folders that never quite fit properly in her desk drawer, studying crime scene photographs during lunch breaks and late nights when sleep refused to come. Sarah Fitzgerald's case found its way onto her desk on a rainy Thursday in March, 48 years after that Sunday morning in Morrison Hall. The Berkshire County Sheriff's Department had undergone significant changes since Thomas Keller's retirement. Modern forensic capabilities, computer databases, and a dedicated cold case unit had transformed what was once a small-town operation into a sophisticated law enforcement agency. Santos had joined the department 5 years earlier after a decorated career with the Massachusetts State Police, bringing with her a reputation for solving seemingly impossible cases through persistence and intuitive understanding of criminal psychology. But Sarah's case was different from the others that crossed her desk. The evidence that had been preserved in the courthouse basement for nearly 50 years represented a time capsule of 1971 forensic techniques. Evidence clerk Martha Pereira had maintained environmental controls that inadvertently created perfect preservation conditions for biological samples. The cold, dry basement had acted like a natural freezer, keeping dye intact in ways that wouldn't be discovered until genetic testing became available decades later. Among the carefully catalogued evidence were fingernail scrapings that Dr. Fraser had collected during the autopsy, stored in a small manila envelope sealed with evidence tape that had yellowed and cracked with age. These tiny fragments of skin and blood had waited patiently for technology to catch up with their secrets. Santos partnered with C.C. Moore, a genetic genealogist whose work had revolutionized cold case investigations across the country. The technique, known as investigative genetic genealogy, used DNA profiles from crime scenes to identify potential suspects through their relatives who had submitted genetic information to public databases. The process began when Santos submitted the preserved biological evidence to Uthrem, a specialized laboratory in Texas that could extract usable DNA profiles from severely degraded samples. The fingernail scrapings contained enough genetic material to create a comprehensive profile of Sarah's killer, while a saliva sample from her neck area provided additional confirmation. Dr. David Middleman, Uthrem's founder, had seen hundreds of these cases, but Sarah's evidence was remarkably well preserved considering its age. Within 6 weeks, his laboratory had generated a complete genetic profile that could be compared against millions of samples in genealogy databases. The first match appeared in March 2020, just as the COVID pandemic was shutting down much of the world. A man named Robert Volkov, who lived in Oregon and had never heard of Sarah Fitzgerald, had uploaded his DNA while researching his Eastern European roots. His genetic profile indicated he was a second cousin to whoever had left their DNA under Sarah's fingernails. C.C. Moore spent the next 4 months constructing elaborate genealogical charts, tracing the Volkov family lineage back 3 generations to identify all possible relatives who could have been living in Massachusetts in 1971. The work required searching through birth certificates, death records, census data, and newspaper archives to track dozens of family members across multiple states and decades. The breakthrough came when Moore discovered that Robert Volkov's great-uncle, Vladimir Petrov, had moved from Boston to the Berkshire County area in 1969, taking a job as a maintenance supervisor at Boston College. Petrov had been 43 years old in 1971, married with 2 children, and by all accounts a respected member of the community. His employment record showed that he had access to every building on campus, including the dormitories. His work schedule placed him on campus the weekend of Sarah's murder. But Vladimir Petrov had died in 1994, taking whatever secrets he might have possessed to his grave. The confirmation Santos needed came from Petrov's daughter, Elena Thompson, who agreed to provide a DNA sample after being contacted in summer 2020. She remained skeptical that her mild-mannered father could have been involved in any serious crime. Vladimir Petrov had been a devoted family man, she insisted, someone who never missed school plays or soccer games, who taught Sunday school and had built her a tree house that still stood in her childhood backyard. But when Elena cleaned out her father's former home after her mother's death, she found a disturbing collection hidden in the attic. Dozens of photographs dating back to the late 1960s and early 1970s showed female students around the Boston College campus, taken secretly from distances and through windows. Most disturbing were images of Sarah herself, taken in the weeks leading up to her murder, including one shot through the window of Morrison Hall showing her at her desk, completely unaware she was being watched. When the DNA results came back from the Massachusetts State Police Laboratory, they confirmed what Santos had begun to suspect. Vladimir Petrov was a direct genetic match to the biological evidence found under Sarah's fingernails. The probability of coincidence was less than 1 in a trillion. The revelation that Vladimir Petrov was Sarah Fitzgerald's killer sent shockwaves through the community that had mourned her death for 50 years. Petrov had not been some transient predator who had passed through town and moved on. He had been a fixture in their community for over 2 decades after the murder, living and working among the very people who grieved for Sarah. Employment records from Boston College revealed that Petrov had specifically requested assignments giving him access to female dormitories. He had volunteered for night shifts and weekend maintenance duties, times when fewer staff members were present and students were more vulnerable. His supervisor remembered that Petrov often worked alone and preferred it that way, claiming he was more efficient without distractions. The investigation revealed a pattern of calculated deception that stretched far beyond Sarah's murder. Among Petrov's personal effects, stored in his widow's garage for decades, investigators found a collection of master keys that had been reported missing from the college's security office in 1970. Petrov had apparently duplicated them, giving himself unrestricted access to campus buildings. He had also maintained detailed schedules of student activities, noting when particular dormitories would be largely empty and which students had predictable routines. More troubling were journals written in a mixture of English and coded Russian phrases, documenting his growing fixation with young women and his increasingly bold attempts to get close to them. The journal entry dated October 15, 1971, just 2 days before Sarah's murder, was particularly chilling. Petrov had written about his frustration with a stubborn girl who had seen too much and needed to be taught a lesson. He described his plan in clinical detail, noting that Sunday mornings were ideal because most students slept late and dormitories were quieter than usual. Detective Santos began to suspect that Sarah had discovered something about Petrov's activities, possibly witnessing him stalking other students, or recognizing him from somewhere she shouldn't have seen him. The psychology student's keen insight into human behavior may have made her a threat that Petrov felt compelled to eliminate. As the investigation expanded, Santos reached out to other colleges where Petrov had worked before coming to Boston. His employment history revealed a troubling pattern of short-term jobs at various educational institutions throughout Massachusetts and Vermont, positions he had left voluntarily and without explanation. At each school, there had been reports of missing keys, female students complaining about feeling watched, and in 2 cases, serious assaults that had never been solved. The most disturbing discovery came when Santos contacted the Vermont State Police about an unsolved murder from 1967. Linda Hamilton, a 19-year-old student at Middlebury College, had been found strangled in her dormitory room during Christmas break when the campus was nearly deserted. The crime scene had been remarkably similar to Sarah's, with no signs of forced entry, the victim's body carefully arranged, and evidence that someone had remained in the room after the murder. Vladimir Petrov had been employed as a groundskeeper at Middlebury College from September 1966 until January 1968, leaving his position just weeks after Linda's death. The pattern suggested a predator who had been active for decades, someone who had perfected his methods through practice and learned to avoid suspicion by constantly changing locations. The scope of Petrov's potential crimes raised disturbing questions that extended far beyond Sarah's murder. How many other families had spent decades wondering what happened to their daughters? How many other cases had gone cold because investigators never thought to look at the quiet maintenance worker who seemed so helpful and trustworthy? But perhaps the most shocking revelation was yet to come. The investigation uncovered evidence that Petrov had not worked alone. Buried in his personal papers was correspondence with Dr. Marcus Sullivan, who had been the resident physician at Boston College's health center in 1971. Sullivan, now 81 and living in retirement in Arizona, had maintained connections with Petrov long after leaving the college. Phone records and travel receipts suggested regular contact between the 2 men for over 20 years. When Santos finally tracked down Sullivan's former nurse, Catherine Rivera, the full scope of the conspiracy began to emerge. Rivera, now in her late 70s, had carried the weight of terrible knowledge for nearly 50 years. She remembered the unusual relationship between Dr. Sullivan and the maintenance supervisor, how they would meet after hours speaking in hushed tones about students who had caused problems or needed to be monitored closely. The Monday morning after Sarah's murder, Rivera recalled Dr. Sullivan arriving unusually early, his clothes disheveled and hands shaking as he disposed of several glass vials in medical waste. Years later, she realized those vials had likely contained sedatives that could have been used to incapacitate victims. Dr. Sullivan was arrested in February 2021, 50 years and 4 months after Sarah's murder. His breakdown upon seeing the badge was immediate and devastating, as if he had been waiting his entire adult life for this moment. His confession revealed that Sarah had not been Petrov's first victim, nor would she have been his last if death hadn't intervened. The trial that followed brought justice for Sarah, and at least 4 other young women who had fallen victim to this twisted partnership. For the families who had waited decades for answers, it provided closure they had never dared hope for. Sarah Fitzgerald's case became a landmark example of how modern forensic techniques could solve even the coldest cases, inspiring law enforcement agencies across the country to re-examine their unsolved murders. But perhaps more importantly, it served as a reminder that evil often hides behind facades of respectability and trust, and that the pursuit of justice should never be abandoned, no matter how much time has passed. If this case moved you and you want to see more cold cases finally solved, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Justice may be delayed, but it should never be denied.